So we'll go ahead and get started. And I know folks are coming in, so we'll give them a minute to get on here. But I wanted to introduce myself. If you don't know, I am Marissa McCasty. I'm the Leadership Development Manager for the Suny Sale Institute. And the Suny Sale Institute provides leadership development programming for faculty, staff, and students. And our Leaders Learning Live is professional development for you all at no cost every third Thursday of the month. I do see some folks that join us regularly, so thank you for your loyalty, and welcome to the new folks that are here today to join us. And I would like to introduce our interviewer and our guest speaker. So our interviewer today will be Carolyn Matisky, our very own Suny Sale Associate Director. So welcome, Carolyn. And then we have our guest speaker, Chet Warzynski. He's a sale leadership strategist, and he's an organizational consultant specializing in developing capabilities to strengthen performance in universities, hospitals, Fortune 500 companies, and he provides organizational consulting services in strategic planning, organization design, executive assessment, leadership, and organizational development, project management, and innovation. It's a very long list of great topics. And he's also worked with Suny Sale for many years. And in particular, you might recognize him from our summer leadership retreat. If you have ever been a part of that, he's one of our lead facilitators. And we're so happy to have him here today to talk about the topic of personal and organizational resilience. Just for everyone, just a few housekeeping items. We will have questions at the end. Feel free to put them in the chat and we'll answer them. We'll leave some time at the end for that. This session will be interactive, so that we keep it engaging. And then this webinar will be recorded. So if you want to share it with others that you think would get a lot out of it, feel free to do so. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can find that at the end of this session. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn.
Thank you, Marissa. So I know we have our learning objectives on the next slide. So I just want to remind folks what we're here to accomplish today. So we are hoping that we can help you increase your self-awareness and understanding how to deal with loss. Examine evidence-based approaches for building both your personal and your organizational resilience. And Chet will help us understand what those terms really mean. Understand healthy and unhealthy ways of coping. I think we've had to figure our way out of this over the past few months, so we're going to just touch on some of those coping mechanisms. Develop a theory and strategies for you to be able to build your resilience. So we want to build up our arsenal of leadership skills and help you all get through this challenging time on several levels. So that's what we're aiming to do. And with Chet here to answer some of your questions and some of the questions that we have for him, I think this will be a great hour spent. So again, Marissa said you can send your questions through the chat. As they emerge, feel free to type them into the chat. And I know for many of you, this is sort of a reunion because Chet was your instructor for the program. So if you would like to put your webcam on and say hello and ask your question verbally, feel free to do that at the end. But we're happy to have all of you with us. We actually had 151 people register, so we may have some people joining in throughout the hour, which is great. And if you have to leave us, I know it is the lunch hour, we will record this, so feel free to access the program in the coming days if that will be helpful to you. So thank you again, Chet, for joining us all the way from sunny Naples.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Marissa, and hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to be here with you to talk a little bit about resilience and basically to share with you some of the things that we try to impart to our leaders as part of the Leadership Development Program. I'd like to start maybe by just giving you a little bit of background on my own experience with resilience. I was, many years ago, I was working on a thesis and raising a young family and working full time and doing a lot of what you folks are doing, trying to keep up with all of the demands. And then one day I just kind of collapsed in the kitchen and ended up in the hospital with an ulcer. And fortunately at the time, the university had an executive stress program that I was able to enter and learn about stress and how to deal with stress. And part of that is dealing with resilience and becoming more resilient so that you can deal with some of these demands that you're facing and be able to deal with them effectively as opposed to having them deplete you and end up ill hurting as a result of the demands. So, you know, a second incident in my experience was just this last January. I was speaking to a group of insurance executives on this topic of resilience. And the microphones weren't working. So we had about 200 people in the audience. And so, you know, as a good speaker does, I was walking around trying to get feedback from people with the microphone. Well, this was pre-COVID, you know, there wasn't a lot of information on COVID at that time. And after giving, you know, 15 people a chance to speak, I'm speaking in that same microphone. 5 days later, I had the virus. And so I had to apply all of this information that I have on resilience and managing stress in order to recover. I mean, it was so bad that I even ended up pulling out my will and writing a codicil to my family, you know, in terms of interpreting it. But we're facing a lot today in terms of stress and in terms of the demands that are being placed on us. And so we've got to be resilient to be able to deal with those demands. And so that's what we're going to essentially talk about today.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you were able to overcome that, Chet. When I heard that you were ill and battling for almost a month, you know, it was heartbreaking. So I'm so glad that you were able to get through that battle.
Thank you, Karen. It was, I was glad too. It was really an experience that I haven't had before. I don't think I've ever been that sick.
Yeah. So I think most of us are pretty familiar with personal resilience, but can you help us understand a little bit more about what organizational resilience is?
Well, you know, organizations, we're all part of organizations, and we all have relationships within organizations, and organizations can provide a lot of support for dealing with our resilience. And helping to support us in dealing with many of the difficulties that we're facing. When I think of the concept of resilience, or I think of the construct, I think of it in terms of a triangle. And many of you have seen that triangle where, you know, you have three angles that you're dealing with, and then there's the center of the triangle. The angles are one, you know, your physiological response to situations that you're facing. We only have so much adaptive energy, and when we're using that energy to respond to too many situations, we become depleted. And as our adaptive energy is depleted, we become susceptible to a lot of illness and a lot of erratic behavior. So the physiology and how we deal with our physiology is really important, you know, in terms of our nutrition, in terms of the amount of rest we get, in terms of our exercise and so on. So we can build that adaptive energy. Another angle is, you know, our psychology and our awareness or our consciousness in terms of our behaviors, and particularly our emotions and how we make choices based upon our consciousness. So when we're faced with a situation, do we step back and do we evaluate that situation or assess it? What are the options that we can deal with? And then what are our propensities in terms of responding? And then what choices do we make in responding to the situation? And many of us don't actually step back and look at, our behavior and typically what we do, and consequently we just react to the situation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about coping and defending behaviors. And the third angle in the triangle is the organization, as Carolyn mentioned. We have a lot of things in place in an organization in terms of employee assistance programs where you can go to get some help if you're feeling stressed and you have problems. And you also have your supervisors and your leaders are responsible for, at least helping you to put things into context and to just talk things over with them. But the relationships that we have in organizations are probably the most important aspect of resilience. If we have good relationships and we have people to talk to, and we can get together and we can work on some of the problems that we're faced with as a group, we can become much more resilient. And one of the strategies that we use in organizational development to accomplish this is team building. Getting a group together to say, what do we expect from each other? And what is our culture like? And how can we shape that culture and formulate those expectations where we're all on the same page and we can support each other as we move forward? So those kinds of discussions and coaching that we can give to each other and to our employees become really instrumental in helping us to create a support system to become more resilient. Now, in the middle of that triangle, you can see there's you. You're making the choices. You're deciding how you're going to deal with your body, with the physiology, and how you're going to try to manage your adaptive energy, and how you're going to respond to the organization. But as part of that central core, what is your self-concept? And when we talk about self-concept, how do you see yourself? What is your self-talk like? Is it positive? Is it negative? What are you saying to yourself each day as you go through your day in terms of dealing with difficulties and dealing with a crisis and dealing with losses? So, it's looking at your self-concept, looking at your values, what's important to you, and looking at your attitudes, and what you're saying to yourself. That is really where I think building resilience starts, through this kind of self-awareness and through making some choices on how you're going to respond to situations. And so given that construct, there are several things that we can do in terms of trying to build resilience, in terms of building adaptive energy, building our organization support, making use of that organization support, but then being conscious of how we're going to respond. We're not going to be able to control the environment today. I mean, you can see all the things happening in our environment, with the virus and so on, social justice issues, and people, suffering because of their finances and their employment situation. We can't, resolve many of those situations, so we can't control them, but we can choose how we're going to respond to them. And I think that's what really makes the difference in terms of building resilience.
Yeah, there's so much to think about, Chet, in what you just said. So I think this diagram helps help us get through some of the different aspects of it. So thank you for putting that together for us. I want to ask you about the characteristics that a resilient person possesses.
Well, there are a lot of them. One of them is really, to be proactive. I mean, the fact that you're here, interested in a webinar or a meeting on resilience is being proactive, I think. It's anticipating what's going to happen and trying to determine what actions you're going to take to be able to respond to that situation. And part of being proactive too is being positive and being optimistic. Those are important characteristics. You know, are you looking at the world as, in terms of everything that's wrong, that's going on, or do you have a more balanced view? Are you looking at, you know, some of the good things that are going on today, some of the things that we're really excited about that can really be helpful in terms of our society, in terms of helping to teach our students and to develop, you know, better citizens in our country, as well as to help facilitate the whole learning process. So proactive, being positive, being optimistic, and behind all of those is, you know, what I mentioned earlier, being self-aware. Self-awareness is one of the most critical skills in emotional intelligence. It's being aware of what your emotions are, how you're feeling. And, you know, when you talk to psychologists and counselors, they say there are 4,000 different kinds of feelings, you know, in their vocabulary. And so it's being a nuanced thinker to understand and pinpoint exactly how you're feeling, and then trying to understand that feeling and deal with that feeling. I mean, just becoming aware of it is really important in terms of building resilience. And that ties in, of course, to this emotional intelligence and making good choices, empathizing with other people, being aware of yourself and the choices that you've made in the past, and then really trying to think about, you know, what are we going to do in the future? And how am I going to deal with all these demands that are being placed on me? So that self-awareness is critical. But getting back to that you concept, or the self concept, you know, what is your purpose in life? You know, Viktor Frankl, who spent time in concentration camps, you know, said that meaning was the most important factor in people surviving under those very difficult circumstances or impossible circumstances. People who had a sense of purpose, who had clear values, who had a sense of meaning in their lives tend to be much more resilient. And, you know, so what we do for leaders is we try to help leaders develop their personal mission. You know, what am I trying to do in life? And what's your vision? How am I going to try to how am I going to try to live that mission? And what are my values? What's important? You know, a philosopher once said, the nut of existence rings hollow unless you can answer the question, who am I? And what do I stand for? You know, what's my identity? What are my values? That's a fundamental source of strength if we can clarify those values and we have that personal mission and vision. So that sense of purpose. Then you could talk about being flexible, being adaptable, you know, not putting, you know, everything behind, you know, one situation, being able to withdraw from that situation when necessary, to be able to put it into perspective sometimes through a sense of humor and being able to laugh at it. But one of the things that, you know, I found most interesting, you know, and one of the teachers that I had in terms of resilience was a guy by the name of George Valen. And George was the head of psychiatry at Harvard Medical. For many years, he was also head of the adult development program, which is a 60-year longitudinal study, you know, of how adults develop. And, you know, basically what George said was, you know, strong relationships are the most fundamental aspect in terms of being resilient, in terms of dealing with difficulties, and even in terms of aging. You know, as we want to, those of us who are getting up there in years want to try to slow that aging process down. And George has written some great books on that. One is called The Triumph of Experience, in which he talks about, you know, people who have relationships, you know, were much more resilient, much more successful, much healthier, and much more satisfied with their lives, you know, over the course of this 60-year study. And then, you know, you have to mention, you know, overcoming yourself, you know, because sometimes we're the obstacle to our resilience, and we're not exercising, we're not making good decisions, we're not taking advantage of the things that exist. So it's really sometimes pulling away from ourselves and trying some new things. But faith is probably one of the most important things. And actually, George does talk about faith as well. He says spirituality is really important in terms of being resilient, in terms of dealing with all the issues that we are facing in our lives. So those are some of the characteristics, but it's interesting that you know, in giving some of these seminars on resilience, I got an email from one of my students saying, and Chet, don't forget a glass of red wine. You know, sometimes a glass of red wine or some it could be a good palliative and help to deal with some of the difficulties we're facing.
That's great. Chet, I know you want to share with us some work around grit, but before we do, I just have one more question. So I know we're talking about both personal and organizational resilience, and something you said about for the importance of leaders understanding their purpose. You know, that's the foundation of leadership, right? Day one of our summer retreat, we talk about understanding yourself. But when we think about organizational resilience, I found myself going back to our mission and our vision, because there are so many things happening and swirling and changing and crises that you feel like you have to respond to, that I found it helpful to go back to that as a sort of a guide for us. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or guidance for others.
Well, you know, your mission and your vision for yourself, you know, and your values actually serve as criteria for looking at what's important and what's not important, and for setting priorities. Now, I mentioned that part of resilience is being able to anticipate. And when we anticipate what's happening in terms of if we can anticipate what's happening in terms of our values, we can set priorities. And we could try to parse through some of the situations rather than trying to deal with them all at once. So, you know, being able to have a set of priorities and deal with them, you know, systematically, as opposed to trying to resolve all of our problems at the same time, is probably a good way of dealing with resilience. You know, the psychologists say that taking that first step is really the most important. And we know this in terms of our own to-do lists. You know, we have long, you know, some of us pages long to-do lists. And, you know, we're feeling overwhelmed. But once we've selected one of those items and have made a little progress on it, we feel a whole lot better. So it's kind of like the self-overcoming thing too. You know, it's overcoming the inertia, you know, or the, you know, and that we're feeling.
Great. So I think at this point in the program, you wanted to get the audience to interact a little bit and understand themselves a little bit more, because we know that's important. So can you share a little bit about the grit test?
Well, Angela Duckworth, I met Angela at the Positive Psychology Center, developed this concept of grit and developed this grit scale. And Angela has been, you know, using this for some time. Now, grit, when you think of grit, what do you think of? You think of, you know, perseverance, hardiness, you know, toughness, you know, dealing with all the exigencies of life, you know. And Angela, you know, developed a set of questions which were used to actually assess and to identify how much grit people have. Actually, when I was at Cornell, we brought Marty Seligman in, and that's how I got connected with the Positive Psychology Center, and met Angela. But we did a number of assessments, and we found that in certain departments, you know, there were very high degrees of depression in the university. You know, people feeling, you know, kind of not connected and very depressed, and how do they bounce back? So we actually developed exercises around, you know, how to deal with some of the stress that people have, and how to be more affirmative with each other in terms of dealing with situations to overcome this depression. But Angela has done a lot of good work in this area and continues to do a lot of good work in this area. So I think we have an assessment that you can take to assess how much grit you have in terms of dealing with all the difficulties that you're facing.
Yes, and it's very short. So we thank you, Jason, for sharing that link right in the chat. So at this point, we encourage you to navigate to the grit test. Hopefully you can just escape from the Zoom screen and do both at the same time. but we'll still be here, and we're gonna just take a 5-minute pause to let you complete that grit scale. So everybody will come back and have their score. If you wanna share your score in the chat, that way we know that you're complete, that would be great. And I see my team is joined in here, Marissa and Joyce. Hopefully you had a chance to, or will have a chance to do your own grit score too. I did it in preparation for this. It's enlightening to just go through and see how you measure up. I know they used to use this for applicants to West Point. Chet, can you see the chat? It looks like we have a fairly resilient group here. Upper threes. We've got someone over 4.2, 409. Got a whole variety of scores here, Chet. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about our audience here today, but we've got scores ranging from, I think I saw a 2, wow, 4.59. I think that might be the highest I saw. So Chet, we're going to pull up the poll question too, because it looks like most people have had a chance to complete this. So this will just give us a summary and sort of give us some data to work with. All right, so what range are you in? We'll give everyone a minute to answer that. Do you see the responses coming in, Marissa? Oh, good.
Yes, and I think we have most of them, so I will show the results.
Yeah, so the majority of people have a score somewhere between 3 and 4, which seems pretty good to me. What do you think, Chet?
Yeah, I mean it's surprising, you know, that there are not many more in the 2 and 3 category, 1 and 2. I guess in higher education you have to have grit to survive. Maybe that's why
Maybe.
the high scores.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if these scores are impacted at all by, sort of the day of the week and where we are in terms of crises, because we've had quite a few things come our way. So I don't know if the scores stay sort of stable or if they're impacted by the context.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the biggest things that I've noticed in terms of, context is the amount of uncertainty that exists today. You know, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether there's going to be courses in the fall. We don't know where this virus is going. People wondering about their livelihood, their finances. So I mean, it's there's so much going on and so much uncertainty that it's fortunate that we have some of these high scores, I think.
So what would you say to folks that feel they don't have enough grit? Can they get more?
Well, I think well, that's what, in a sense we're trying to look at here, is how we can become more aware, of where we are and how we're responding to the situation. There's that a chart that Marissa showed on the COVID virus. Who do I want to be during this COVID virus? And the initial responses start, with fear. We're afraid that our family's going to become ill. We're afraid that we're going to get the virus. We're afraid of the impact it's going to have. And as long as we're in that fear category, we're depleting our adaptive resources. Fear, we're sitting there and we're fearful. And that's actually taking away our energy. We need to get beyond fear. We need to be able to get to that learning zone. And, do we have data? Can we get some data? And I mean, it's one of the things that, if you're following the news, that, we're not very good in terms of tracking the data around the virus. We're having big rallies and people are going out to pubs and bars that are open, and even the protests present some significant issues from the standpoint. So hopefully we're learning, and the three things obviously that we really need to learn are: one, to wear face masks, to maintain social distance from each other, and to wash our hands a lot. But I mean, there are other things that we need to learn about it as well, to be able to manage our choices. And we want to get to the growth zone where we really, in a sense, have overcome our fears, overcome ourselves and some of our major concerns, and start to really take action. What can we do to help each other? What can we do to help our society? What can we do to help our students? And start doing something rather than just trying to defend our feelings about the situation. So I think, that's where, giving us a trajectory where we really need to go in terms of dealing, with some of our difficulties, and some of the difficulties over which we have no control. I mean, there's a lot to be afraid of here. The Spanish flu, they estimate between 20 and 50 million people died worldwide. I think it's catastrophic.
So, Chet, there's some positive feedback about this from Fear to Growth diagram that we're looking at. And question, are you the author of this?
No, actually, I found it on the web, and I couldn't find the attribution. So I don't know actually where it came from, but when I saw it, I said, "Wow, this is great."
It really is.
It really does explain a lot, and gives us some guidance in terms of where we really need to go.
Yeah. You talked about the self messages, and I think if we find ourselves in the fear zone, maybe just reminding ourselves one of the the learning zone behaviors, maybe just a daily affirmation, to try to get ourselves unstuck and out of that.
It's funny that you should mention that, because that was one of Marty Seligman's, from the Positive Psychology Center's, favorite exercises. When you get up in the morning, look in the mirror and ask yourself, what 3 things am I blessed with, or that are blessings in life? You know,
Yeah.
and it does generate or engender, you know, a much more positive attitude, which, you know, certainly can help in terms of dealing with resilience.
Yeah, yeah, I do the same thing. I think I try to be as specific as possible about the 3 things I'm grateful for when I wake up, and I try to do it before I allow myself to put my feet on the ground. And I do find it helpful. I heard that advice a while ago. And yeah, so I think there's a lot here from this chart that can start to help us. The other thing that I did, you talked about writing a list, and I read somewhere that instead of writing a to-do list, if you start by writing what you did, your accomplished, like the three things that you accomplished. And it sounds a little hokey, but it actually, I did practice it, and it's pretty powerful.
And, well, you know, that ties into another, you know, good strategy, and that, you know, do you keep a journal? You know, one of the things we recommend for, you know, to all leaders is that they maintain a journal, you know, describe what's going on. You know, it not only has a cathartic effect, you know, being externalizing it and getting outside of yourself, but it also gives you something that you can refer back to. In terms of you know, the accomplishments that you've made as a result of your day, and it takes you out of this state of being in well, what some psychologists call an oceanic fusion, where everything kind of comes together. You know, yeah. Kind of pulls it out and gives you something to respond to. So journaling can be very therapeutic.
So I think we have a lot that you could say for this next question, but what kinds of things test our resilience?
Oh, yeah. What immediately came to mind was Jean-Paul Sartre's play No Exit, you know, in which people who are condemned to spend their entire life with people that they just couldn't stand, you know, and that was the punishment, that was hell. But, you know, people, you know, I think are certainly, you know, one of the tests of our resilience, and that includes family, it includes friends, you know, it you know, includes, you know, if we start to go to politics and look at politics, it includes people, you know, in politics. It includes sometimes our bosses and leaders. So you know, that's a really big category, you know, of our sources that test our resilience. But I think an even bigger one is ourselves. You know, and I mentioned that, you know, self-overcoming. You know, we are often our own worst enemies in terms of, you know, our habits, in terms of, you know, our reactions to a situation, in terms of failing to become conscious enough and failing to have enough empathy, and our own emotional intelligence. And so, you know, that's an area that, you know, from a leadership standpoint, that we really need to examine and make some decisions around and develop some strategies, you know, to deal with ourselves. And then, of course, there's finances and the external world, you know, and all of the threats that exist within our environment that we have to deal with. But I think, you know, if we started with ourselves, I think that would be a good place to start, because we don't want to just allow our own defensive behaviors to block our understanding of the larger world. You know, we're interdependent. We've got to recognize that there's more to the world than just us, but we have to start with us. And then we have to move out to, you know, dealing with others, and to building those relationships, and to establishing and affirming each other, and then to trying to address the problems, you know. And I think that's what that COVID chart basically suggests, you know, that process.
Well, thank you, Marissa, for putting this triangle back up, because I want to focus a little bit on that coping styles. So Chet, I want to ask you to sort of clarify that what's the difference between defending and coping behaviors?
Well, you know, I mentioned George Valent, and George was, you know, as a psychiatrist, you know, dealt with psychodynamics and, you know, defensive behaviors and what he called coping behaviors, you know. And so in his initial study, which was called An Adaptation to Life, George traced a cohort of about 260 some, I think, people over 35 years to see how they adapted, and how they dealt with difficulties, and how they solved problems. And what he found was that the way they respond to crisis and conflict and problems and difficulties was critical in terms of their satisfaction with life and their fulfillment, sense of fulfillment with life, in terms of their success, in terms of their work and what they were doing, and in terms of their health. So he differentiated these two sets of choices that people make, or behaviors that people adopt, that are directly related to health, satisfaction, and success. And one he called defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms, he defined defense mechanisms as behaviors that protect the way we feel, or help us to feel a certain way. And he defined coping mechanisms as more active, action-oriented behaviors to help deal with the situations that we're faced with. So defense behaviors, and these are the ones that are related to dissatisfaction and illness and lack of success, are, you know, when we have difficulties, if we start blaming other people, what do we accomplish? I mean, typically defending behaviors boomerang. If we're blaming people all the time for our own unhappiness and for what's going on in the world, we're not solving the problem. If we make excuses, and you know, in higher ed, we're very good at developing theories and making excuses and developing rationalizations. And if we're just doing that, and we're making excuses and rationalizing why certain things are happening, and not going beyond that, we're not addressing the real issues. If we're fantasizing about winning the lottery, and winning the lottery is going to take away all my problems, guess what? The data says it's not. The data says it's going to give us more problems. So that's acting out impulsively, you know, and reacting to a situation. Reaction formation, it's called. Impulsive behavior of transferring, denying that anything is wrong. I mean, you talk about, you know, the COVID virus, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are just in denial. They're saying, I don't need to wear a mask. This is a democratic hoax. You know, which is a rationalization and a denial. So, I mean, you know, these are defending behaviors. These are designed to protect their feelings. They're aimed at our feelings. They're unconscious, often unconscious, because we've learned them through development. They tend to be repeated. We repeat them over and over again. They're exaggerated. And they usually boomerang. They work against us. They actually cause illness, dissatisfaction, and more problems for us. On the other hand, the coping mechanisms that Valent identified in this third, and by the way, he actually wrote another book called The Wisdom of the Ego, in which he looked at the lives of famous people and their defense mechanism. A very interesting book. You know, as well as I mentioned, the triumph of experience, you know, which takes off on the adult development study. But the coping mechanisms that are really important are, one, to anticipate the situation. What is coming down the road? You know, do I have any data in terms of I can formulate some hypotheses or anticipate what might be happening, and then being able to set some priorities, you know, in terms of dealing with the situation. So that's a coping mechanism. It's action oriented. It's looking at changing the situation. It's looking at improving the situation. What are some other coping mechanisms? Of course, you know, there's one of the famous ones is called sublimation, and the sublimation simply means rechanneling. You know, if I can't solve this problem of COVID, what am I going to do? What am I going to do that's going to be positive and constructive and going to be helpful? You know, I could start learning another language. And many people are taking some of this time, you know, to try to improve themselves and learn another language. I could learn to play piano, play a musical instrument. I know a couple of people who are doing that, you know, in terms of sublimating or rechanneling. Or I can start growing my own vegetables, or I can start becoming a prepper, you know, and have a place underground, you know, that I'm preparing. But you're doing something constructively. You're taking action. You're not just dwelling on your feelings.
Yeah.
Other good coping mechanisms are, you know, really being able to laugh at a situation, to develop a sense of humor about it, you know, and to put it into perspective, kind of, so to speak, you know, to plan and problem solve, you know, really critical. But a big one that Peter Drucker always talked about, you know, for busy executives and leaders is altruism. He said, you know, when you're under a lot of stress and you want to be more resilient, he said, don't just go home and wallow in your feelings. He said, go out and help somebody. It pays back. It makes a difference.
It does.
So I see a lot of people today protesting, you know, and really trying to help change our culture and trying to help society. And this is a very healthy way to deal with, you know, with COVID and deal with difficulties that we have. You know, it's taking that action. It's aimed at the situation and changing the reality. It's a conscious attempt. It's a choice, a conscious choice to change. It usually values yourself, and it usually helps the situation. So that's the difference between kind of coping and defending. When you're defending, you're just protecting your feelings. When you're coping, you're out there doing something and trying to solve the problem and change the situation. Does that help?
It's great. It's great. And actually, I would love to hear from the audience. So I'm asking you to share some coping behaviors that you found helpful. Chet gave a lot of great examples, and I know I just bought a paddle board so that hopefully I can get out on the water and do something positive this summer without, you know, a big crowd or going anywhere that would put me at risk. But I think everyone is finding their own way to cope hopefully in a positive way. I love your example of or your reminder to be altruistic and think about others, and it really does help you. Even as a parent, you know, I can see my children going through this just like we are. And so this weekend we baked and we gave away the baked goods. And so just making a little delivery and doing something nice for others, it made them feel better. So I can see the rewards, and I'd love to hear what everyone else is doing to cope with all of this. So Chet, what are the signs of a person who struggles with this?
Well, you know, typically in what we refer to, you know, these symptoms as signs of strain. You know, and you have physiological signs of strain and psychological signs of strain. Physiologically, you know, you're starting to get sick a lot. You know, you're nervous, you're perspiring, you're anxious, you have anxiety. What else? You know, sometimes you're fatigued. I mean, when I had the virus, I could hardly get out of bed. You know, I was so fatigued, and I was checking my oxygen levels, you know, 5, 6, 7 times a day, you know, to see whether or not, you know, I had to, you know, get a ventilator, go on a ventilator. So, yeah, I mean, those are some physiological signs of strain. You know, psychologically, we become sometimes indecisive. We have a hard time sleeping, so insomnia can be, you know, a critical factor there. Apathy, you know, we start to become indifferent toward things and toward people, you know, turning inward. Anger, you know, acting out, becoming very irritable and explosive. So, you know, I think those are some of the typical signs that we have to be aware of. I mean, you know, you could also be checking your you know, pulse rate and, you know, your oxygen levels and so on, you know, to find out. But those are some of the major signs of strain that, you know, you're under a lot of pressure and your body is starting to tell you something and your mind is starting to tell you. Confusion. is another one where you become kind of foggy and confused, and you're not thinking very clearly. So those are the things to watch for. When you start to see those signs, it's a good idea to get help, to really talk to somebody, a professional. Let other people know that you're feeling this way. Really try to get some support.
Yeah.
Because I think you can run yourself down so low that you kind of just give up.
Yeah. Another thing that I think we're all seeing rise is addiction and overdose rates. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or want to add to that, but it is alarming. And, we joke about a glass of wine, but I think for some people it could become a bit of a crutch. So it just, we're all trying to focus on the positive. But I think it's important that you point out those early signs that there could be a struggle.
You're absolutely right, Caroline. Even, suicide rates are going up, especially amongst young people. And this is really a cause for major concern. When people feel they don't have anything, to live for, so, we really have to be cognizant of these in ourselves, but also cognizant of what other people are feeling. And this is where the empathy kicks in. One of the real positive signs to me, in terms of, the social justice issues and the culture issues that we're facing today, is to see people empathizing with each other. I mean, we haven't seen that since the 60s, where people really got together and started really understanding how each other's feeling and trying to help each other, and I think that's a positive sign in our society.
Yeah. So Chet, we have a lot of leaders and managers in the webinar today. So what can we do as, someone who has a team that we're trying to help and lead? What can we do to help them find their resilience?
Well, I think, one of the first things is really being open to listening to what people are feeling and thinking. And being observant, understanding and observing their behavior and recognizing when we see something that looks amiss, and being willing to talk to people and to coach them, to help them, to counsel them even, to find out what's going on in their lives, and not just just be concerned or self-centered in terms of our own life. So as a leaders are responsible for taking care of their employees and connecting with them and building relationships with them. And so I think that's really important. I mentioned earlier team building, as a way, resetting your objectives, trying to establish new expectations. There's not going to be a new normal for some time. We're going to be in a state of, ambiguity, I'm afraid, which is going to contribute to some extent to the confusion and to the indecisiveness and uncertainty that we have. So it's really being able to talk about it, to communicate with each other, and to affirm each other. I think, one of the things that Martin Buber, a philosopher, once said, he said, we in affirming each other and affirming our life and affirming our faith, we transform both. And so I think it's through this positive affirmation. We call it, appreciative inquiry in organizational development. Instead of looking at the glass as half empty, look at it as half full and be thankful for what we have, and recognize the blessings that we have, and really being able to support each other. And I think that's a really important part of leadership, and a part of what we can do to try to help ourselves. And guess what? In helping others, who are we really helping? We're also helping ourselves, right?
No, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. So I think at this point we have about 8 minutes left. So I want to open it up to the audience to see what questions they have for Chet. So if you'd prefer that we unmute you, we can do that. Just let us know. And I know Marissa's been looking at the chat a little bit more closely. So if there are any questions that we missed from earlier, let me know.
There's some really good coping strategies that everyone put in the chat. Thank you for that.
And, you know, looking at the cup half full, it is June. This is usually many people in New York, our favorite time of year. You know, the sun is shining and we can get outside and enjoy some summer activities. So even just being outdoors, I think, is one of those things we can count in the positive column.
You know, the other thing is, you know, I didn't mention a lot about mindfulness, but that's really, you know, there's a big movement today toward becoming more conscious and slowing down our mind and being able to find space, you know, to help put things into perspective. And so, I mean, there are things from breathing exercises. You know, I practice what I call a 3-5-8 breathing process, where I breathe into 3, hold for 5, and exhale to 8. And do that for about 10 minutes, and you know, you know, I'm totally relaxed after that. And then you can do some visualization along with that. Even I got to be careful when I say this, because I have Alexa here on my desk. Even asking Alexa to hypnotize me.
Oh, that's great.
She brings up a menu of, do you want to relax? Do you want to change something in your life? Do you want you know, to you know, help somebody else? You know, so there's a whole menu of things you can select that will take you through an actual hypnotic inductive technique. You know, to actually try to rehearse what you would like to do. There's also a wonderful website called hypnosisdownloads.com, which has almost 500 different inductions that you can purchase and listen to as an MP3, that almost solves or deals with any problem you can imagine. You know, problems with kids, problems with health, problems with other people, problems in work, you know, problems with yourself. So I mean, this is like a lot of the self-growth things that we could be doing, you know, and the meditations that we can be doing. So I think meditation is a really important part of finding balance in your life, and I think that can really be helpful. Yeah. As well as, you know, reconnecting with some spirituality. I think that people, the data is very clear. People who have a sense of spirituality are healthier, happier, and tend to be more successful.
That's great. I've used the 3-5-8 technique when I have trouble falling asleep, and it really does work. I only have to do it a few times and I'm out. So Chet, you mentioned a download for the hypnosis, and someone's asking for the link. Can you say the website again?
It's one word, hypnosisdownloads.com.
That's great. That's great. And there was another reference that you made.
I found it very helpful as a leader to help steer people. I used to actually do it with my students. I used to take them through inductions, and they loved it, you know, as a way of just relaxing. Every class I would start, they would say, let's do a hypnosis. Not today, kids.
That's great. You know, there was a book recommendation that you made earlier, The Master of the Ego. Was that the right book?
The Wisdom of the Ego.
The Wisdom of the Ego.
By George Valent, that talks about, you know, some famous people and what their defense mechanisms were and the consequences of their defense mechanisms. The other books, Adaptation to Life, that he wrote, that's about the study of the students from Harvard, the 30-year study. And then The Triumphs of Experience is one of his latest books. Which deals with the adult development study, which was the 60-year study. And then I'll mention one more. George would love me for all of these recommendations. He's a very humble guy, and he doesn't think much of himself, but I think the world of him. His book is called Anti-Aging. And, so I'm certainly into that kind of thing. So,
well, it's working for you, Chet.
Aging process.
You're ageless. Any questions from the audience? Here's Hope has a question. And you will remember Hope from last summer. I do have a question about how to position communication as a leader to not react, but to respond in these times. When to do it, how to use social media in a way not reactive, but supportive. In a way to be aware of the community and helping all be resilient.
Those are, yeah, I think that's a really good thought on communication. You know, I don't know if you read the Times, but I was looking at the Times today. They have a Thursday morning discussion amongst some of the editors, opinion editors. And, you know, they talk about, you know, the importance of communication, especially in our society. And today's session was really interesting in that it dealt with, you know, how do you deal with social media that is blasting and is very destructive and attacking and putting out information that is harmful, you know, to society. And so, you know, that was what the whole conversation was about today. And I found it, you know, fascinating. But communication is in itself is therapeutic.
I think you've given us so many pearls of wisdom here, Chet. So for anyone who was feeling stuck before they joined, I think you've given us some things that we can do to put one foot in front of the other. And we'll definitely share these slides with the group, and the recording we'll post. But I think with our final minute here, I want to say goodbye and thank you for all you do for Suny. You know, it's bittersweet that we have you here today, because you're not going to be with us for our week-long retreat, which we usually have. So because of COVID-19, we have to put a pause on our very popular summer leadership program, but we're looking forward to 2021, and we hope that the rest of this year is healthy and you find happiness and joy. So, you know, it's wonderful to see you here today, Chet.
Thank you all, you know, and keep the faith, you know. Enjoyed being with you today, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, we have up on our screen, we'll put a link in the chat, as well as email everyone with, like Carolyn said, the handouts and the slides so that you have it. And then we will also have our recording up on our website. And you can go there to find that and all of our other previous webinars, and to register for our future webinars. So we look forward to seeing you in next July 16th, which is that third Thursday of next month. So take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.